In 1983, a school board in Pickens County, Alabama, published official specifications for the wooden paddle used to hit students, 24 inches long, 3 inches wide, half an inch thick. That was not a scandal, that was policy. Here are 30 things about 1980s schools that still sound made up. The Ditto machine was the beating heart of every school office in the 1980s, and it came with a gift no teacher intended. Fresh worksheets arrived at your desk still damp, printed in that unmistakable purple ink, and carrying a sharp, sweet chemical smell that students treated like a reward. The duplicating fluid was a blend of methanol and isopropanol, two industrial solvents that vaporized on contact with air. Kids pressed their faces into the paper and inhaled deeply, sometimes competing for the freshest sheets with the strongest scent. Teachers rarely stopped them. The 1982 film Fast Times at Ridgemont High captured it perfectly, showing an entire classroom sniffing their handouts in unison. Nobody called it chemical exposure. They called it Tuesday. The A.B. Dick Company, which built most of the machines, filed for bankruptcy in 2004, long after photocopiers had replaced the purple-stained empire. Every science lab in the 1980s had a small square pad called wire gauze that students picked up with their bare hands and held directly over an open Bunsen burner. The heat-resistant center of that pad was made of asbestos. Every time a student adjusted the gauze while it was still warm or brushed the fraying edge with a finger, microscopic fibers could break loose and drift into the air. Nobody wore masks. Nobody wore gloves. The teacher said, "Be careful with the flame." The asbestos was never mentioned. Congress passed the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act in 1986, requiring schools to inspect for asbestos every 3 years, but that law targeted building materials, not lab equipment. Those wire gauze squares sat undisturbed in classroom supply cabinets well into the next decade. Gym teachers in the 1980s had a name for dodgeball that told you everything about how it was played. They called it murder ball. Two teams lined up on opposite sides of the gymnasium, and the rubber balls between them were not the soft foam versions sold today. They were hard, dense, and designed for kickball, with a surface that left raised welts on bare skin and enough weight to turn a close-range throw into something closer to assault. Hit someone, they sat down. Get hit, your dignity went with you. In 2013, the Journal of Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance inducted dodgeball into its Hall of Shame, alongside Red Rover and the rope climb. But the original version was worse. A 1922 guide published by Junior ROTC described a variation where the outer team threw medicine balls, weighing 7 to 12 pounds, at kids trapped in the center of the circle. When a glass thermometer broke in a 1980s science classroom, the lesson stopped and something far more interesting began. Mercury scattered across the lab table in tiny silver beads that rolled and merged when you pushed them together. Students poked the liquid metal with pencils, corralled it with index cards, and sometimes cupped it in the palms of their hands. Teachers treated it as a minor inconvenience. Someone wiped the table with a paper towel and class resumed. What nobody mentioned was that mercury vaporizes at room temperature into an invisible, odorless gas that accumulates in enclosed spaces. Between 2002 and 2006, American Poison Control Centers received over 37,000 calls about children exposed to mercury, and more than 30,000 of those involved broken thermometers. A 2004 case in New Jersey found roughly 100 children exposed at a daycare center built inside a former thermometer factory. Before anyone worried about what kids were breathing in science class, some schools had already solved a different problem by giving students a dedicated place to inhale something worse. If you attended high school in the early 1980s, your campus may have had a designated smoking area where students could light a cigarette between classes without fear of detention. At Cheyenne East High in Wyoming, the class of 1983 remembered multiple spots, including a courtyard by the cafeteria and a path from the boys' locker room to the parking lot. In Minnesota, one district installed a school-sanctioned smoking bathroom, reasoning it was better to contain the habit than let students destroy every lavatory in the building. Most of these smokers were 14 to 18 years old. By September of 1981, districts started reversing course, stationing police near campuses to ticket underage smokers. For years before that, lighting up at school was not rebellion, it was infrastructure. The metal slide at your school was a sheet of polished steel bolted to a frame standing 10 or 12 feet tall, anchored directly into concrete and completely exposed to the sun. By mid-afternoon in any state south of Ohio, that surface became a griddle. Temperatures on sun-baked steel could reach over 150 degrees, hot enough to cause contact burns on the backs of bare legs in seconds. Kids invented their own workarounds. They poured water down the chute, slid on wax paper stolen from lunchboxes, or simply launched themselves off the sides when the heat became unbearable. There were no plastic alternatives, no shade structures, and no heat-reducing coatings. The Consumer Product Safety Commission pushed for design changes, but most schools did not swap steel for molded plastic until the late 1990s. Near the ceiling of every school gym, a thick braided rope hung from a steel hook, dangling 20 or more feet above a single mat so thin you could feel the hardwood floor through it. The gym teacher blew a whistle, and one by one students were expected to climb. No harness, no second mat. The spotter was usually a classmate whose attention lasted about 4 seconds. In 2013, the rope climb was inducted into the Physical Education Hall of Shame, described as a perfect storm of low participation, extreme danger, thin mats, inattentive spotters, rope burns on hands and legs, and the grand spectacle of one student struggling while an entire class sat and watched. For the handful who reached the top, the reward was a view of ceiling dust and exposed ductwork. For everyone else, the reward was shredded palms and a grade that punished them for having short arms. Walk past the faculty lounge in any 1980s school and you could smell it before you reached the door. Cigarette smoke hung in visible layers above a coffee pot, a microwave, and a table covered in half-graded papers. Teachers smoked between periods, during planning time, and in some buildings, during staff meetings while discussing curriculum. A 1988 survey by the National School Boards Association, conducted alongside the American Cancer Society, found that many districts had no tobacco policy at all. In elementary schools without a dedicated lounge, teachers ducked behind the building or stepped into a hallway corner. When districts finally banned indoor smoking on campus, teachers moved to their cars in the parking lot, creating a daily ritual visible to every kid who looked out the window during class. In 1977, the Supreme Court ruled in Ingraham v. Wright that hitting a student with a wooden paddle did not qualify as cruel and unusual punishment. The case involved a Florida junior high student who was restrained by his assistant principal and struck more than 20 times, hard enough to require medical attention. The court ruled 5-4 that the Eighth Amendment applied only to convicted criminals, not to kids in public schools. That decision shaped the entire decade. By the early 1980s, 4% of all American students were paddled each year. The Board of Education in Pickens County, Alabama, published specifications for the recommended paddle, 24 inches long, 3 inches wide, and half an inch thick. The Society for Adolescent Medicine estimated that between 10,000 and 20,000 students needed medical treatment annually as a result. Most were paddled for talking in class, dress code violations, or running in the hallway. A 1984 EPA survey found that approximately 35,000 American schools contained asbestos, putting 15 million students and 1.4 million staff members at risk of exposure. That was not an estimate. That was a direct count based on sampling 2,600 school districts. Asbestos had been built into ceiling tiles, floor tiles, pipe insulation, boiler rooms, cafeteria walls, and auditorium panels because the material was cheap, fireproof, and held structures together for decades. It also shed microscopic fibers every time a ceiling tile cracked, a pipe joint was bumped, or a janitor scraped the floor. National asbestos usage had peaked in 1973 at over 800,000 tons per year. Congress passed the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act in 1986, but the law required inspection and management, not removal. Schools were told to leave undamaged asbestos in place and monitor it. If what was inside the walls was not bad enough, what coated them made it worse. Lead-based paint was banned for residential use in 1978, but nobody came to scrape it off school walls. Buildings constructed before that year, which covered the vast majority of American public schools, kept their original coatings for years and sometimes decades. When the paint cracked and peeled, it created chips and fine dust that settled on windowsills, desks, and floors where young hands touched every surface. The danger extended past the classroom. Drinking fountains in older buildings ran through lead service lines and brass spigots that leached the metal directly into the water. The Safe Drinking Water Act was not amended to address lead in plumbing until 1986. The EPA did not mandate lead abatement regulations for school buildings until 1998, 20 years after the residential ban. Every school bus in the 1980s was a 40-foot steel box with vinyl bench seats, no seat belts, and a single rear-view mirror that could not cover half the passengers. The federal safety standard, FMVSS 222, relied on a concept called compartmentalization, meaning seats were packed close together with padded high backs so that in a crash, students would theoretically be contained between the rows. That theory assumed every child sat upright and faced forward. In practice, kids stood in the aisle, sat sideways, knelt backward on seats, and threw objects across the bus at highway speed. The National Transportation Safety Board recommended lap and shoulder belts for school buses multiple times over the decades. States declined, citing retrofit costs that would run into the billions. As of today, only a handful of states require three-point belts on new large school buses. The greatest moment in any 1980s classroom was the instant the lights went off and the teacher wheeled in the AV cart. A 16mm film projector sat on top, heavy as a cinder block, trailing a power cord that stretched across the floor like a tripwire. The projector ran hot. The bulb inside operated at temperatures high enough to melt the film if it jammed, and students trusted to thread the reel often had their fingers inches from exposed mechanical parts spinning at speed. Below the projector sat the overhead unit, built by 3M starting in the early 1960s and used by the military before it ever reached a school. Its glass surface could burn a hand flat. The fan motor hummed loud enough to drown out the teacher, and the entire setup plugged into a wall outlet that in most older buildings had not been rewired since the school was built. In September of 1981, the Reagan administration proposed new rules for the National School Lunch Program that would have allowed ketchup to count as a vegetable serving. The proposal came from the USDA's Food and Nutrition Service, which had been ordered to cut $1 billion from child nutrition funding and given 90 days to figure out how. Their solution included reducing portion sizes, allowing pickle relish to substitute for a vegetable, and permitting soybean curd to replace meat. Budget Director David Stockman later called it a bureaucratic goof and said the Agriculture Department had not only egg on its face, but ketchup too. Senate Democrats staged a photo op where they ate the proposed mini-meals on camera. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia held up a bottle and noted that ketchup was now a vegetable. The rules were withdrawn within 15 days, and the USDA administrator who wrote them was reassigned 2 days before Thanksgiving. But the funding cuts went ahead anyway, and over 3 million students dropped out of the lunch program. The federal government could not even keep ketchup off the vegetable list, so it should come as no surprise that nobody was regulating the merry-go-round. The steel platform sat low to the ground, bolted to a center post over concrete or packed dirt, with grab bars that were either too hot from the sun or too slick from rain. There were no speed limiters, no friction brakes, and no way to stop the thing once the biggest kid in the group got it spinning. The centrifugal force launched riders sideways off the edge and onto whatever surface the district had poured underneath, which was usually asphalt. In 1995, McDonald's was forced to finance a $5 million child safety campaign after the Consumer Product Safety Commission determined that merry-go-rounds were responsible for 104 documented injuries during the 1980s alone. Lawsuits in New Jersey and other states eventually made officials too nervous to keep them, and the platforms were ripped out by the dozens. Under federal labor law, minors are prohibited from operating power-driven woodworking tools in the workplace. Table saws, bandsaws, lathes, routers, and jointers are all explicitly banned for workers under 18 by the U.S. Department of Labor. But that rule applied only to employment. In school shop class, students as young as 11 years old used that same equipment every week. A Utah statewide study of school injuries between 1992 and 1996 found that 7% of all student injuries happened in shop class, and nearly half of the equipment-related cases involved saws. Table saws and bandsaws each accounted for 12 to 15% of shop injuries. Equipment was being misused in roughly 38% of cases. The safety gear was whatever the teacher had available, which in many districts meant a pair of scratched goggles and a reminder to keep your fingers clear of the blade. If you spent a week of gym class learning to do-sa-do and swing your partner, you can thank Henry Ford. Not for the car, for the racism. Ford hated jazz music, which he believed was invented by Jewish people as part of a conspiracy to corrupt American society. In Volume 3 of his 1921 publication, The International Jew, he wrote that popular music was a Jewish monopoly and jazz was a Jewish creation. His solution was to replace jazz with square dancing, which he saw as intrinsically white and therefore wholesome. In 1926, he published a manual called Good Morning and hired an instructor named Benjamin Lovett to bring square dancing into public school gym classes across the country. By 1928, nearly half of all American schools were teaching square dancing as part of the physical education curriculum. Ronald Reagan even declared it the national dance in 1982. 28 states still list it as their official state dance. Chalk dust hung in the air of every classroom like a permanent weather system. Teachers wrote on blackboards all day, erasing and rewriting until the fine white powder coated their hands, their sleeves, and the first 2 rows of desks. The erasers were dense blocks of felt packed with calcium carbonate, and when a student was assigned eraser clapping duty as punishment, the job involved standing outside and smashing 2 erasers together until the cloud was thick enough to taste. Nobody wore a mask. Nobody questioned why the air near the board always felt gritty. Studies later linked chronic chalk dust exposure to respiratory irritation in teachers who worked with it for decades, but at the time, the white film that settled on every surface was treated as part of the scenery, like fluorescent lighting and linoleum floors. Before every school had a computer lab, it had a typing room. Rows of manual typewriters sat on heavy wooden desks, and students spent entire class periods hammering the keys as hard as they could because each keystroke required 8 to 12 pounds of force just to make the letter strike the ribbon. There were no wrist rests, no ergonomic guidelines, and no awareness of repetitive strain. Carpal tunnel syndrome was not widely recognized as a workplace condition until the early 1990s, long after millions of students had already spent years pounding those stiff mechanical keys. The machines themselves weighed over 20 pounds and had exposed moving type bars that could pinch skin if a finger slipped during a fast run. The electric models that replaced them felt like a luxury, even though they came with their own hazards. The typing room prepared your wrists for damage, but the hallways had something that could cut them. A Wisconsin shop teacher named Stuart Anders invented the slap bracelet in 1983 after playing with a steel ribbon in his father's workshop. The original slap wraps were 9 inches of flexible stainless steel, about 6/1000ths of an inch thick, covered in colorful fabric. When you slapped one against your wrist, it curled around tight. Main Street Toy Company began selling them in 1990, and within months, they were everywhere. The problem was the knockoffs. Cheaper versions used thinner steel with rougher edges, and when the fabric covering wore through or tore, the exposed metal strip could slice skin on contact. Schools across the country banned them. In 2012, 89,500 ToySmith Snap bracelets were recalled for laceration hazard. In 2018, Target pulled over 22,000 more off shelves. You drank from the hallway fountain every day without thinking about what was inside the pipes. In schools built before 1986, the plumbing commonly contained lead solder, and the brass spigots on the fountain itself could leach lead directly into the water, especially first thing in the morning when water had been sitting in the lines overnight. The Safe Drinking Water Act was amended in 1986 to reduce allowable lead content in plumbing, but the law applied only to new construction and major renovations. Older schools kept their original pipes. The EPA did not require schools to test drinking water for lead until 2017, more than 3 decades after the law changed. For an entire generation, the fountain at the end of the hallway was dispensing more than water. Red Rover was the recess game that gym teachers either loved or pretended not to see. 2 lines of kids linked arms and faced each other across the field. One side called a name, and that student sprinted full speed at the opposing chain, trying to break through. The linked arms acted like a clothesline across the chest and neck of whoever ran at them. Dislocated shoulders, broken wrists, and concussions were common enough that the game was eventually inducted into the Physical Education Hall of Shame alongside dodgeball and the rope climb. The danger was structural. There was no way to play Red Rover safely, because the entire point of the game was one child running at full speed into a human wall. Some districts banned it outright. Others just stopped mentioning it in the curriculum and hoped it would fade from the playground on its own. In 1951, the federal government produced an animated film starring a cartoon turtle named Bert, who taught American schoolchildren to duck under their desks and cover their heads in the event of a nuclear attack. The duck and cover drill became standard practice in schools throughout the 1950s and 60s, and in some districts it persisted well into the 1980s, driven by a fresh wave of Cold War tension under the Reagan administration. Students crouched beneath wooden desks with their arms wrapped around their necks while teachers timed the drill. The desks were designed to hold textbooks. They were not designed to hold back a blast wave. By 1961, the Soviets had tested a 58-megaton thermonuclear bomb called Tsar Bomba, a weapon with a force equivalent to more than 50 million tons of explosive. Some cities even distributed military-style dog tags to students so their bodies could be identified after a mass explosion. New York City alone spent $159,000 on student identification tags. Kids in the 1980s brought cap guns to school the way kids today bring fidget spinners. The toy pistols were built from die-cast metal, weighted to feel like the real thing, and finished in chrome or black paint that made them nearly indistinguishable from an actual firearm at any distance beyond arm's length. The caps themselves contained small amounts of potassium perchlorate, an explosive compound that detonated on impact with a sharp crack and a puff of smoke. Students popped them on the playground, in the hallway, and sometimes during class. Teachers confiscated the guns when they became disruptive, but nobody treated them as a threat. Zero-tolerance weapons policies did not appear in American schools until the early 1990s. Before that, a realistic toy gun in a backpack was a confiscated item, not a suspension. The thing that could actually hurt a student in the cafeteria was not a toy. It was lunch. Peanut butter sandwiches were a staple of every school meal program in the 1980s, spread on white bread and served alongside a carton of milk without a second thought. Peanut allergies were essentially unrecognized in the American school system until the late 1990s. There were no nut-free tables, no ingredient labels posted in the kitchen, and no EpiPens stocked in the nurse's office. Anaphylaxis was not part of teacher training. If a student went into shock after eating, the response was to call an ambulance and hope it arrived in time. The first school-wide peanut bans did not appear until around 2000, driven by parents who had watched their own kids stop breathing after a cafeteria lunch. For the decades before that, peanut butter was served to every student every day without anyone asking a single question. Home economics class in the 1980s taught students to bake, sew, and use a kitchen safely, and then handed them a pair of asbestos oven mitts. The heat-resistant gloves were standard issue in home ec kitchens and science labs across the country, chosen for the same reason asbestos showed up everywhere else, because it could withstand extreme temperatures without catching fire. Students grabbed hot trays, pulled dishes from ovens, and handled heated beakers with gloves that shed microscopic fibers every time the fabric flexed or frayed. Unlike the asbestos embedded in ceiling tiles or pipe insulation, These gloves were in direct contact with bare skin, used repeatedly, and stored in open drawers where the fibers could settle on other supplies. They were never recalled. They were replaced one pair at a time, only when they wore out. In the 1980s, plenty of elementary schools had open campus lunch policies that let students as young as 10 years old walk off school grounds to eat at a nearby diner, corner store, or fast food restaurant. There were no sign-out sheets, no parent permission slips for daily departures, and no staff members monitoring who left or when they came back. The policy assumed that kids who lived close enough to walk home for lunch would simply return when the bell rang. Some did. Others wandered. The liability questions that dominate school policy today did not carry the same weight in an era when districts operated on trust and tight budgets. Open campus policies started disappearing in the 1990s as concerns about traffic, abduction, and liability pushed districts to lock the doors and keep everyone inside. The smell hit you before you even sat down. Biology class in the 1980s meant dissecting frogs, fetal pigs, and sometimes cow eyes that had been preserved in formaldehyde, a chemical so pungent it stung your nostrils and made your eyes water from across the room. Students cut into the specimens with scalpels and probes, handling tissue that had been soaking in the solution for weeks. The standard protective equipment was nothing. No gloves, no goggles, no fume hoods. The classroom windows were cracked open if the teacher remembered. In 2004, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified formaldehyde as a Group 1 carcinogen, meaning there was sufficient evidence it caused cancer in humans. That classification came decades after millions of students had already spent entire class periods with their bare hands submerged in it. School lab ventilation standards were not widely updated until the late 1990s. Tetherball was the recess game that required one piece of equipment and zero adult supervision. A heavy rubber ball hung from a rope attached to the top of a metal pole, and two players stood on opposite sides, punching the ball in opposite directions until one player wrapped the rope completely around the pole. The court was concrete or asphalt. The ball weighed enough to snap a head backward on a clean hit to the face. There were no rules about where you could stand, no protective gear, and no padding on the pole itself, which was a steel pipe sunk into concrete at chin height for a 10-year-old. The game was never formally banned from most schools. It just quietly vanished from playgrounds as districts replaced equipment and nobody ordered a new pole. If the fire alarm sounded in a 1980s school and you were on the third floor, your emergency exit might not have been a stairwell. It was a canvas chute. Tubular fire escape chutes became widely accepted for schools and hospitals in the 1930s, replacing open iron ladders on the exterior of multi-story buildings. The enclosed fabric tubes hung from upper floor windows and funneled students down to the ground in a controlled slide. During drills, kids climbed onto the windowsill, grabbed the edges of the chute opening, and dropped into a dark fabric tunnel with no way to see the bottom. The 1908 Collinwood School fire in Ohio, which killed 172 students and 2 teachers, had driven the push for these escapes. Laundry sorting was another ordinary but crucial skill. Students practiced separating whites, colors, and delicates, learning firsthand how a red sock could ruin a load of white shirts. Teachers explained water temperatures, fabric types, and detergents, emphasizing prevention over repair. Laundry sorting was about saving clothes, but it was also about saving money. Families could not afford to constantly replace ruined garments. It taught kids to pay attention to details, to pause before tossing everything into the machine. That small moment of care often saved hours of frustration and money later. The lesson was not glamorous, but it prepared students to take care of what they owned. Today, many households rely on machines with preset cycles and built-in safeguards, but accidents still happen. In the 1970s, sorting correctly meant the difference between fresh-looking clothes and a disaster. Home economics turned laundry into a science lesson, reminding kids that small habits make a big difference. Looking back, it is hard not to see the wisdom in teaching something so practical. They were the size of drumsticks, dull at the tip, and impossible to sharpen. Those big red pencils were supposed to help us learn penmanship, but mostly they just gave us hand cramps. Every worksheet had lines stacked on lines, and every letter had to hit the dotted center just right. Uppercase, lowercase, loop the G, tuck the tail of your J, nothing felt natural, and everything smudged. And that pink eraser on the end? Useless. It just smeared everything and tore the paper, but the teacher still made you use it. Your pencil case barely held the thing, and when it finally broke in half from sharpening too much on the wall crank sharpener, you were secretly relieved. You tried to make your cursive pretty. You tried to stay within the lines, but really, you just hoped the teacher would not call you up to write on the board. Somehow, those giant pencils made us feel smaller, but they also made us laugh and groan through every loop, line, and lopsided capital D. Using a sewing machine was an initiation into the world of hands-on creativity. Students learned to thread the bobbin, guide fabric under the needle, and keep their seams straight. Teachers assigned projects like aprons, skirts, or pillowcases, grading not just the finished product but also the effort. The hum of sewing machines filled classrooms, a chorus of clattering needles and nervous students concentrating on every stitch. Mistakes meant tangled thread or crooked hems, but those errors were part of the learning process. The satisfaction of finishing a project, no matter how uneven the stitches, gave students a sense of pride. It showed them that effort and persistence could turn fabric scraps into something useful and lasting. Beyond making something wearable, the lesson taught self-sufficiency. Students realized they could create, alter, or repair items without ever stepping into a store. In today's throwaway culture, the skill feels almost revolutionary. Back then, it was simply another part of preparing for adulthood, a reminder that every stitch had value. Looking back, it is clear how much confidence came from being able to make something with your own hands. The chalkboard was a massive green wall of stress. The teacher scribbled across it with dusty precision, filling it with math problems or spelling lists that ghosted even after being erased. But the real fun came at the end of the day when someone got picked to clean the erasers. It sounded like a reward, but it was a trap. You carried the erasers outside, banged them together until a cloud of chalk exploded in your face, and returned to class looking like a powdered donut. It never felt clean enough. The chalk got on your shirt, your face, in your hair, and somehow up your nose. But it was still an honor to be chosen. Some days you got to spray the board with water and use a felt rag to wipe it down, leaving streaks behind like abstract art. Other times you just smeared the dust around with a dried-out sponge. Still, it felt important. It felt like part of the day, and for a few minutes you were not just a student, you were part of the cleanup crew, keeping the room in shape. Plus, it got you out of your seat, and that was always worth it. Cleaning techniques for different surfaces were treated like science experiments in home economics. Students learned that not every spray bottle was the same, and that wood, glass, and tile each required their own approach. Teachers passed out rags, bottles, and buckets, then divided tasks: polish the wooden desk, wipe down the windows, scrub the linoleum floor. The point was simple but powerful. The right cleaner protected surfaces, while the wrong one caused damage. Glass streaked if you used the wrong cloth, wood dulled if you skipped polish, and countertops stained if you ignored spills. Students quickly realized that cleaning was not just about appearances, it was about maintaining what you had. Today, multi-purpose wipes promise to do it all, but in the 1970s and 1980s, home economics broke cleaning down into steps and categories. It was about taking care of your home with intention, not just speed. Kids may have groaned when told to polish brass or scrub sinks, but later in life they knew exactly which products to buy. Looking back, it feels old-fashioned, but there is no denying it gave kids the tools to keep a home looking sharp without ruining it in the process. The second you saw the purple ink, you knew it was go time. Timed multiplication drills printed on ditto sheets were the stuff of sweaty palms and pencil-breaking panic. The clock started, and your brain emptied. Suddenly, 6 times 7 was a mystery, and 8 times 8 felt like quantum physics. The ink smelled weird, sweet and chemical, almost like old perfume. You secretly sniffed the page before starting. Everyone did. Then the teacher said, "Go," and the room filled with frantic scribbling and suppressed groans. You always tried to beat the kid next to you, but if you finished too fast, it looked suspicious. Messy handwriting meant automatic red marks, and heaven forbid you skipped one. The teacher would circle it in red like it was a federal offense. If you got a perfect score, your paper went on the wall. If not, you just hoped it did not come back with too much red. These drills were meant to make you faster, but mostly they made you dread anything involving numbers. Still, when the time was up and you slammed your pencil down with a gasp, it felt like surviving a small war. Math trauma aside, there was something oddly satisfying about filling in every box, especially if you actually got them right. Balancing a checkbook was a cornerstone of home economics. Every student learned how to track deposits, withdrawals, and expenses by hand, using nothing more than a pen, paper, and patience. The ledger was a simple grid, and the goal was accuracy. Your math had to match the bank's math. Teachers drilled the importance of recording every single transaction, whether it was $5 for gas or $20 for groceries. There was no app to do the work for you. Mistakes meant overdraft fees, bounced checks, and embarrassment at the counter. Learning to balance a checkbook taught students discipline, responsibility, and attention to detail. Today, online banking makes the process automatic, but in the 1970s and 1980s, this was the only way to stay afloat. Students may have groaned over the repetitive math, but years later, many of them would admit the skill kept them out of financial trouble. It was not glamorous, but it was practical, and it made adulthood less daunting. Looking back, it feels like one of the most useful lessons schools ever gave. You were half asleep, the lights were off, and suddenly, beep. That was your cue. Someone, usually the most nervous kid in class, had to turn the knob to advance the film strip one frame at a time. And it never went smoothly. The teacher would fumble with the cassette player, pressing rewind and play too many times while the film strip clicked forward with a wobble. The narration always sounded like someone had just woken up and read a textbook out loud. It droned on about volcanoes or the water cycle while the tiny slides advanced, slightly blurry and crooked. Every kid sat there pretending to care, but we all lived for the next beep. And if you were the one in charge of turning the strip, the pressure was enormous. Miss the beep, and the whole room groaned. Go early, and the teacher gave you the look. The film strip itself would fall out of alignment halfway through, and then the teacher had to stop the tape and try to fix it while everyone giggled in the dark. It was chaos disguised as learning, and yet it felt like a treat. The room went dark, the windows glowed, and for 30 minutes nobody had to raise their hand or do math. Just sit, listen, and wait for the next beep. Honestly, that sound lives rent-free in our brains to this day. Meal planning on a budget was a survival skill wrapped into a classroom assignment. Students were told to imagine feeding a family of 4 for a week with a limited amount of money. Out came grocery flyers, blank charts, and calculators. Teachers guided kids through the realities of choosing beans over steak, potatoes over convenience foods, and stretching leftovers into new meals. It was a practical math lesson disguised as cooking, showing how every dollar could be stretched if you thought ahead. Students learned to look for sales, compare prices by ounce, and balance nutrition with cost. Today, meal planning often means scrolling through apps or ordering meal kits, but back then, it was about survival and strategy. Home economics turned abstract numbers into dinner on the table, giving students a glimpse of real adulthood. Looking back, it is striking how much confidence this skill gave kids who grew up to run households of their own. You flipped to the inside cover and there it was, a manila pocket glued to the back of the book, holding a yellowed card filled with names and stamped dates. Before barcodes and scanners, this was how you checked out library books. It was simple. It was analog. It was kind of brilliant. You wrote your name on the line, the librarian stamped the due date with that loud chunk, and the book was yours for 2 weeks. Seeing someone else's name on the card made the book feel worn in, like it had history. You always wanted your name to be on the card more than once. It made you feel like a true fan. And if your crush had signed it first, that book became sacred. The pockets always peeled at the edges. The cards were usually a little bent, but that was part of their charm. If you lost a book, that card came back to haunt you, stamped over and over like a permanent record of failure. But if you returned it on time, it felt like winning. These little pockets turned books into memories, made you feel seen, and added a tiny thrill to every checkout. And to this day, you probably still remember the smell of that library: dust, paper, and possibility. Mending rips with needle and thread was one of the simplest but most satisfying lessons. Students brought in torn fabric or old jeans, and teachers showed them how to stitch cleanly, reinforce seams, and hide the repair. It was not about perfection. It was about extending the life of what you already had. Every rip mended was a small act of thrift, a reminder that you valued what you owned enough to fix it. The act itself was calming, turning frustration into focus as kids watched the fabric come back together. For many, it was their first experience of creating solutions with their own hands instead of buying replacements. The pride in fixing something rather than throwing it away gave kids a sense of control. Teachers reminded them that waste was costly, and repair was a form of respect for resources. Even a crooked stitch felt like a victory when it gave new life to a favorite pair of jeans. Kids often rolled their eyes at the assignment, but years later, many admitted the skills saved them countless times. Today, fast fashion encourages replacing instead of repairing, but in the 1970s, home economics taught the opposite. A little thread could make clothes last another season, and that mattered in households on tight budgets. Looking back, it is a lost art that deserves more appreciation. They came in a plastic box that clicked shut like a treasure chest. Smelly markers, the forbidden fruit of the school supply shelf. You were not supposed to smell them, but everyone did. Cherry, grape, root beer, licorice. Why was there always licorice? Every color had its own scent, and if you got the black marker, you were either brave or had no taste buds left. The teacher would say, "These are for coloring, not for sniffing." But you knew she was lying. She sniffed them too. You had a favorite scent and a least favorite, and trades were serious business. If someone left the cap off, you gasped in horror. It was like wasting gold. There was always one marker that got crushed or lost under the radiator, and its scent would haunt the room forever. And the red marker? It smelled like cherry cough syrup and made half the class gag. You knew you were not supposed to do it. You knew it probably gave you a headache. But the second you opened the box, the instinct took over. The smell of those markers defined elementary school. They were a little dangerous, a little gross, and absolutely irresistible. And if you say you never took a big sniff, you're lying. Writing and following a household budget was a central part of the curriculum. Students were asked to imagine they had a job, a family, and bills to pay. They created budgets on paper, balancing rent, groceries, utilities, and extras like entertainment. Teachers emphasized the importance of spending less than you earned and saving for emergencies. Budgeting showed students that money was not abstract. It was survival. It was a lesson in trade-offs. A new pair of shoes might mean less money for groceries, and every choice had weight. Kids learned quickly that numbers on paper translated into real-life comfort or stress. The practice taught discipline in a way no textbook could, because every fake dollar on the page represented something real in life. Students felt the weight of deciding between wants and needs, and it stuck with them. Budgeting became less about math and more about learning priorities. Every choice had a consequence, and discipline meant the difference between stability and stress. Today, apps track spending automatically, but in the 1970s, the responsibility was entirely on you. Home economics gave kids a glimpse of what adulthood demanded and prepared them to face it head-on. Looking back, it feels like one of the most important lessons schools ever offered. There it was, taped to the bulletin board in all its laminated glory, the classroom job chart. Everyone had a role: line leader, door holder, calendar updater, and the much-feared bathroom monitor. Your name, written on a clothespin, got moved around weekly, even though the same kids always ended up doing the actual work. Being line leader was the crown jewel of the chart, and if you got it, you strutted through the hallway like you were royalty. Paper passer was a close second, only because you got to walk around while everyone else stayed seated. But let's be honest, the worst job was board cleaner. No one wanted to smear yesterday's chalk dust around with a crusty rag. And when you were stuck with plant waterer, that meant you were officially on leaf duty for a sad spider plant hanging on by a thread. Clothespins always fell off. Someone always lost theirs. The system worked about half the time, and yet teachers clung to it like it was sacred. The job chart was supposed to teach responsibility. What it really taught us was that fairness was just a concept, and that Becky was always going to get line leader 2 weeks in a row. Still, you checked it first thing Monday morning, every time, because that clothespin, at least for a moment, meant you had a title. Making and following a recipe card was a ritual of home economics. Teachers handed out handwritten cards, often faded from use, and students were expected to follow them step by step. Ingredients had to be measured by hand. Cups, spoons, and scales were all part of the process. Missing a step meant the dish failed, and there was no undo button to fix it. Recipe cards were lessons in precision and patience, teaching kids to slow down and pay attention. The stains and smudges on old recipe cards told stories of countless meals cooked and shared. Students realized they were holding more than instructions. They were holding a piece of family history. Teachers explained how recipes passed through generations, connecting students to grandparents and traditions beyond the classroom. Every card told a story, and kids began to see food as a bridge between past and present. The recipes made cooking feel less like a chore and more like an inheritance. They also carried a sense of tradition, with many cards copied from older generations. Today, recipes live on screens, easily swiped or skipped, but the old cards demanded focus. Home economics turned cooking into more than nourishment. It became a way to connect with family history. Looking back, it is clear how those simple cards carried not just instructions, but values. When you saw the television cart being wheeled in, everything else stopped. A boxy black set strapped to the top of a metal cart meant one thing. Today was not a real school day. Teachers sighed with relief. Kids cheered like it was a holiday. You were either getting a documentary about volcanoes or a grainy animated short with questionable voice acting. Sometimes the TV would buzz and roll the picture until someone smacked the side. The antenna never worked, and if it was a substitute teacher, it was basically guaranteed. The rolling cart always squeaked, and the cords trailed behind like a hazard waiting to happen. The janitor probably fixed it 10 times a year. The best days were when the lights were off, the curtains were closed, and the teacher told you to take notes while no one even pretended to. You sat in rows, staring at the fuzzy screen like it was a gift from the heavens. That cart was heavy. That screen was small. But when it entered the room, it felt like a break from the usual, and that made it gold. Cooking from scratch was one of the first lessons students tackled in home economics, and it set the tone for everything else. No boxed mixes, no frozen shortcuts, just raw ingredients turned into meals with patience and practice. Biscuits, casseroles, soups, and pies were staples, each one starting with flour, eggs, butter, and a few simple tools. Teachers walked students through every step: how to sift flour properly, how to knead dough until it was elastic, and how to test if something was fully cooked without relying on timers. Cooking from scratch mattered because it was about more than food. It was about independence. Knowing you could feed yourself or your family with just the basics was a form of security. The smell of bread baking or a casserole bubbling in the oven carried a pride that no box mix could match. Today, prepackaged meals and takeout are everywhere, and while they save time, they lack the satisfaction that came from creating something from the ground up. Back then, cooking was not just a class assignment. It was a foundation for adult life. Looking back, it is easy to see how valuable that skill was, and hard not to wonder why it disappeared from classrooms. They buzzed, they flickered, they hummed louder than the entire class combined. Overhead projectors were the high-tech marvel of the school day, and if you went to school in the 1970s or 1980s, You definitely remember the smell of overheating plastic sheets and the teacher wrestling with a transparency that was curling at the corners. The teacher would write with those squeaky markers that stained everything, always forgetting which way the transparency was supposed to face, and then flip it over while we all tried not to laugh. The bulb inside got hot enough to fry an egg, and you could always count on the glass surface being covered in smudges and fingerprints from the last 5 lessons. And of course, someone would always touch the glass while it was on, get mildly burned, and act like they were dying. Teachers would scold us not to lean on the cart, but we all did anyway. The shadow of the teacher's hand waving across the screen somehow made the whole class lose focus. The projector sat on that rickety wheeled cart, usually missing at least one rubber stopper so it would roll if the teacher moved too fast. And when it finally broke or needed a bulb change, forget it. That was the end of learning for the day. It was awkward, it was clunky, but somehow it was magic. And when the projector turned on, we all leaned in just a little closer, mostly to see if something would catch fire. Sewing on a button was one of those small but essential lessons. Teachers brought in shirts and scraps of fabric, handed out needles and thread, and showed students how to loop, stitch, and secure a loose button. The process was simple, but it required care. Tight enough to hold, loose enough to move. A missing button could make the difference between tossing a shirt and wearing it for years. Sewing on a button was never about fashion. It was about resourcefulness. It taught patience, fine motor skills, and the idea that you did not throw things away at the first sign of wear. Today, clothes are cheap and easy to replace, but back then, families stretched every garment as far as it would go. Home economics gave kids the confidence to fix what was broken instead of discarding it. The lesson was not flashy, but it was empowering. Proof that even a teenager could keep their wardrobe intact with a few stitches. Looking back, it is remarkable how such a small skill carried so much weight. You had to ask for permission. You got up, walked to the front, and made eye contact with everyone along the way. Then came the sound, grinding, loud, and just a little embarrassing. Wall-mounted pencil sharpeners were noisy and unpredictable, chewing up pencils like they had a personal grudge. You never knew how far to crank. One turn too many and your pencil became a useless nub. One turn too few, and it barely made a point at all. Some kids turned it into a performance. They cranked for 30 seconds just to make noise. Others tried to sneak one quick grind and ended up showering the floor in shavings. The clear plastic casing always got stuck. The blades dulled fast. And if someone dared sharpen a colored pencil, the entire class turned against them. Still, it was a rite of passage. Your turn at the sharpener meant you got out of your seat, even if just for a moment. It was noisy, it was clunky, and it was oddly satisfying. Baking bread from scratch was the ultimate patience test in home economics. Students measured flour, water, yeast, and salt, then mixed, kneaded, and weighted. The dough had to rise, be punched down, shaped, and baked, all steps that could not be rushed. Teachers walked students through the science of yeast, showing how something invisible created the rise that made bread soft and airy. The smell of bread baking in school kitchens lingered in hallways, and even kids who hated cooking could not help but smile. The process was slow, but it carried a reward that felt almost magical. Some students complained about the waiting, but when the first warm loaf came out of the oven, the lesson clicked. Bread was more than food. It was patience, science, and tradition combined. It taught that the best results in life often came from time and care. Today, bread is bought pre-sliced in plastic bags, but back then, learning to bake it yourself was a mark of real skill. Home economics made sure every student experienced that pride, even if their first loaf came out lopsided. Looking back, it was both a science experiment and a life lesson rolled into one. It looked easy, just pinch and pull, but those little paper milk cartons were folded like a puzzle from the future. You opened it wrong? Instant milk explosion. You opened it right? Still probably spilled. Some kids poked a straw in the side, others ripped the top completely off. It always smelled a little sour. You never trusted the date stamped in purple ink. And somehow, Chocolate milk was colder than the white milk, every time. Lunch trays clattered, someone dropped their milk. The janitor sighed, and there was always one kid who drank 4 cartons without blinking. You drank yours fast. It never tasted great, but it was cold, and it was part of the routine. And if you could get the flap open in one try, you felt like a champion. Those little cartons taught us patience and how to mop up messes fast. They clanged when they dropped and chipped like old cars. Understanding nutrition labels was a crash course in health long before apps tracked every calorie. Students were handed boxes and cans, told to read the fine print, and then asked to break it down. Calories, protein, fats, sugars, and serving sizes. The exercise was not just about numbers, but about understanding what those numbers meant for your body. Teachers explained why protein fueled muscles, why fats mattered for energy, and why too much sugar left you sluggish. It was an eye-opener for many, realizing that the healthy cereal they ate for breakfast might actually be loaded with sugar. Kids learned to compare 2 similar items side by side, discovering that small choices added up to big differences. Nutrition labels became less of a mystery and more of a tool for smart living. Today, labels are still printed on every package, but many people ignore them, trusting marketing slogans instead. Back in home economics class, though, every line was discussed, every percentage explained. It was not glamorous, but it was practical knowledge you could carry into adulthood. Looking back, it is clear how valuable it was to learn that your health was written right there on the side of a box. You just had to know how to read it. The teacher yanked it down with a dramatic flourish and immediately regretted it. Pull-down maps were the ultimate classroom gamble. They unrolled with a creak, hung crookedly, and never ever rolled back up on the first try. There was one for every subject. The United States, ancient civilizations, rainfall distribution, something involving tectonic plates. You never knew which one would appear, or how long it would take to wrestle it into place. When the teacher tried to roll it back up, it would stop halfway, or shoot up too fast and slap the roller with a deafening bang. And that was the most exciting part of geography class. Sometimes the pull cord snapped, leaving the map stuck forever. Sometimes the corners curled and made everything look like a pirate treasure hunt. You would stare at the map instead of listening to the lesson, tracing borders and imagining road trips. If you were lucky, the teacher would forget to pull it back up and it would just hang there, blocking the chalkboard like a misplaced curtain. They were wrinkled, outdated, and unpredictable. But when the map came down, you knew it was time to learn something. Maybe. Or at least time to laugh when it snapped back up like a mousetrap. Hand-washing delicate fabrics was one of those lessons that sounded unnecessary at first, but proved vital later. Teachers explained that not all clothes could survive the rough cycle of a washing machine. Delicates like silk, lace, or wool had to be soaked, swished, and rinsed gently by hand. Students were given basins, mild soap, and delicate scarves or blouses to practice with. The idea was to respect fabric, to treat it carefully so it lasted longer. Kids realized that tossing everything into one machine load could shrink sweaters, warp blouses, or unravel lace. Learning to hand wash was about patience, not convenience, and it taught respect for the value of clothing. Today, labels often say dry clean only or machine wash cold, but the art of hand washing is nearly forgotten. Back then, it was part of the routine, especially in homes where wardrobes had to last. It was not glamorous, but it was empowering to know you could save a favorite shirt from ruin with nothing more than a sink and some soap. Looking back, it is a small but meaningful skill that kept families looking sharp on limited budgets. They were made of wood, metal, and pure chaos. The desks with lift-up tops were designed to store your books, but mostly they stored mess, forgotten notes, and gum wrappers. You lifted the lid carefully, unless you were mad, in which case you slammed it for effect. The hinges squeaked. The inside smelled like paper and pencil shavings, and there was always a pencil stuck at the bottom that no one could reach. Opening one too fast made it crash like thunder. And if you accidentally pinched your finger in the hinge, you remembered that pain for life. They were part desk, part booby trap. You were supposed to keep them organized. You never did. At any moment, the teacher could ask you to open it for a surprise desk check. Cue silent panic and fast shuffling. You decorated the inside with stickers or doodles, passed secret notes through them, hid snacks when no one was looking. They were noisy, they were heavy, but they were yours. And nothing beat that sound when the whole class slammed them shut at the end of the day. Teachers explained that not all clothes could survive the rough cycle of a washing machine. Delicates like silk, lace, or wool had to be soaked, swished, and rinsed gently by hand. Students were given basins, mild soap, and delicate scarves or blouses to practice with. The idea was to respect fabric, to treat it carefully so it lasted longer. Kids realized that tossing everything into one machine load could shrink sweaters, warp blouses, or unravel lace. Learning to hand wash was about patience, not convenience, and it taught respect for the value of clothing. Today, labels often say dry clean only or machine wash cold, but the art of hand washing is nearly forgotten. Back then, it was part of the routine, especially in homes where wardrobes had to last. It was not glamorous, but it was empowering to know you could save a favorite shirt from ruin with nothing more than a sink and some soap. Looking back, it is a small but meaningful skill that kept families looking sharp on limited budgets. The chute was considered a safer alternative to the staircases that had trapped those kids. Whether dropping into a canvas tube from a third-floor window felt safe was another question entirely.